Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to a first step to easing his war in Ukraine, pledging to pause strikes on energy targets for 30 days. But he appeared resistant to the complete ceasefire the U.S. President Donald Trump had pushed for during their highly anticipated phone call.
Mr. Putin also agreed to swap 175 prisoners of war today, including 23 seriously wounded Ukrainian servicemen, in what the Kremlin called a gesture of goodwill. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has criticized that Putin has effectively rejected the proposal for a full ceasefire and says it shows that Moscow is not ready to end this war.
All right, joining us for more analysis is Dr. Sonia Mycak, a research fellow at ANU Center for European Studies. Thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, just want to get your reaction to what came out of that call. What stood out for you?
What stood out for me is that it's very far short of a full ceasefire that, of course, President Zelenskyy of Ukraine had agreed to immediately. Secondly, this is a strategic decision on the part of Russia. A ceasefire on energy infrastructure is also a great advantage for the Russian military, because that is precisely an area in which the Ukrainian military had been quite successful. Just in this year alone, the Ukrainian military had managed to strike 40 Russian oil depots and refineries using long-range drones going over 1,200 kilometres into Russia. So this is certainly an advantage for Russia, as much as, you could say that it's a humanitarian gesture. And I think the other thing that we need to be aware of is that we don't see any change in Putin's actual aim and intention in this war. Russian forces will continue to strike Ukraine, to rain bombs and drones, thousands on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure all across Ukraine. That will not continue. That will not change. That will continue. And secondly, we don't see any concessions spoken of on the part of Russia. Certainly, immediately, Putin has stated that he is going to require a complete withdrawal of foreign aid to Ukraine. These kinds of statements show that there is no real change in Putin's aim and agenda.
So it doesn't really sound like you're very confident that this 30-day pause on attacking energy infrastructure will actually hold. Am I correct in saying that? And if it does hold, what impact would it have on the ground?
Well, first of all, if it does hold, any step that alleviates at least some of the pain and suffering that the Ukrainian people have endured for, not only 3 years since the full-scale invasion, but actually 11 years of war, but certainly over the last 3 years, any step towards alleviating some of that pain and suffering is, of course, a positive step. However, Ukrainians are very wary and are correct to be wary of whether such a ceasefire would even hold, remembering that this war is now 11 years in activity. And for the 8 years prior to the full-scale invasion 3 years ago, Russia had broken many, many ceasefire agreements, more than 25 ceasefire agreements Russia had immediately broken. So there is skepticism in Ukraine as to whether Russia will hold to this. And again, remembering that even if Russia does hold off firing on specific energy infrastructure in Ukraine, it appears that they will continue to decimate civilian infrastructure and continue to kill Ukrainians in other ways.
Professor, as you mentioned, this falls short of an unconditional 30-day ceasefire proposed by Americans. And some experts say it's just striking how little concession Trump is asking from the Russians who have invaded their neighbor. Do you think Mr. Trump will pressure Putin for more compromises? Does he have that leverage at this point?
Look, he certainly does have the leverage. There is more that the United States can do. Certainly economically, there is a great deal more that the United States could do to put pressure on Russia's economy. And one would hope that that is something that the Trump administration will consider. Unfortunately, however, the words and the deeds undertaken by the Trump administration over the last few weeks have actually weakened Ukraine's position. I don't know how many minutes we have left, but I could talk about several steps that the Trump administration has taken, which have been very detrimental to Ukraine. And in fact, I may just mention the most recent, which is that the Trump administration is withdrawing support from key organizations which were documenting war crimes committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine. That's news that appeared only, within the last 24 hours. So unfortunately, it seems that the Trump administration continues to demand all the concessions from Ukraine while not asking for any concessions from Russia.
President Zelenskyy, he has responded. He has said he's skeptical about a ceasefire and he wants to speak to President Trump directly. In the past, he's also pointed out, look, there can be no peace deal without Ukraine's involvement. From your perspective, how important is it that Trump and Zelenskyy make contact again soon? And when do you think that could happen?
Very difficult to say from the point of view that Trump has shown himself to be a very erratic leader in connection with this situation in Ukraine. Certainly, he briefly mentioned some days ago that was a possibility to invite Zelenskyy back to the White House. But of course, not so long ago, we saw a very volatile conversation in which not only President Trump, but those who were accompanying him from his administration publicly berated Zelenskyy. It's very difficult to know how that particular relationship will continue. However, Zelenskyy is correct, of course, in saying that he needs to be involved. And that's part of the wider belief, not only on the part of the Ukrainians, but also European partners believe that any arrangements about Ukraine need to happen with Ukraine being present at the table. Certainly preliminary talks in this way between simply the United States and Russia, perhaps they can move towards, they can be one step towards some sort of arrangement. But in the end, Ukraine needs to be involved if Ukraine is the subject of the discussion.
Yeah, the negotiations are set to begin immediately in the Middle East. We understand. Will Ukraine be involved? We know the importance of their involvement, but if so, what are the prospects of a broader ceasefire coming out of that discussion?
Well, at the moment, I'm not optimistic about the possibility of a really broad, comprehensive ceasefire because I don't believe that the Putin regime will agree to a ceasefire without conditions. Commentators in Ukraine have put it well when they've said that it appears that Putin is saying no disguised as a yes. No to a ceasefire, but we are pretending that we will agree as long as certain conditions are met, and those conditions, of course, will be unacceptable to Ukraine. As I said, until now, and even with this most recent discussion with President Trump, Putin has certainly continued his maximalist demands. Now, they amount to a capitulation or a surrender of Ukraine, keeping control of 20% of Ukraine, controlling Ukraine's future in terms of defense and security, vetoing Ukraine's right to enter into security arrangements with Europe, demanding that European peacekeeping forces are not involved. These are all absolutely maximalist demands that are part of Russia's agenda in this war in total. And it appears that Putin is not stepping back on any of those. And if that is the case, and if that continues to be the case, I don't see how Ukraine can actually agree to any long-term peace arrangement. That would not actually be a long-term peace arrangement. That would simply be a cessation of fighting, which would allow Russia to regroup and prepare itself for what would effectively be a third invasion of Ukraine.
All right, Dr. Mycak, thank you very much for your insight this morning. We've been speaking to Dr. Sonia Mycak, Research Fellow at the ANU Center for European Studies.